as Sam says, we are looking at, there I am, looking at aspects of suffering in Scripture. And we're actually going to be looking at, in a moment, you'll notice we haven't read a piece of Scripture yet. Don't worry, fear not, it's going to happen. We're going to be looking at Psalm 13. And the title of this talk was Painful Lessons Did God Send? Which I will be touching on, but I want to focus on a particular aspect of that I think is relevant to suffering, and hopefully it'll be useful and helpful to you. I don't know whether you know the Far Side cartoons, but this is one of my favorite. This is one of my favorite Far Side cartoons. So you see the cowboys and they're crouching down, and one of them says is, "Hey, they're lighting their arrows. Can they do that?" I don't know why I put American accents and all, but the reason why I really like that cartoon is it's just the indignation that the rules seem to have changed in the warfare between cowboy and Indian. And I love that this guy who has this understanding of how the rules work, and suddenly the enemy has changed the rules. Life is not playing by the rules. And sometimes when we're in a place of suffering, we can feel that a little bit, can't we? This is not how I imagined life to pan out. This is not how, and so suddenly life throws a fiery arrow at you, and the world that we've spent our lives creating and believing in starts to burn. What happens? What do we do? How do we respond to that? I'd love you to think of a time in your life where you went through, historically, went through a difficult period. You're not going to need to talk to anyone about this, but I'm going to ask you 3 questions, and I'd like you to answer yes or no answers. You might want to jot it down or just answer it in your head. So the first question is, think of a time in your life you went through a difficult experience. It might be disappointment, it might be sickness, it might be loss of job, it might be relationship that didn't work out, it might be thwarted plans. First question, do you regret that time? Do you regret it? Second question, so just answer yes or no. Second question, did you learn anything about yourself, God, during that time? And then last question, did God send the difficulty or send that pain so that you could learn from it? Now, the last question is the gnarly question that I'd love us to just think about a little bit about it. I wonder what you answered for that final question. I hope that you answered no. I think that answers the question of the sermon pretty quickly. Don't worry, I've not finished, but I do think that God did not send it, but he, as many of you probably would have thought of, he allowed that to happen rather than to send it. The fact is, it's really important that we are able to answer the question, what do you think God is like? A.W. Tozer wrote this: what comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. What comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. What an extraordinary thing to say. What we perceive God to be like, his nature, is especially in the face of suffering, is absolutely critical. And if we've got a skewed notion of God, then suffering will skew it even more and distort it and really, really affect us. So I suppose what I'm asking is, what is God like? Now, we turn to the scriptures on this, and in the Old Testament, the revelation of God in all sorts of ways, but the most quoted verse in the Bible, by the Bible, is Exodus 34, verse 6. the most quoted verse. The Lord is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, forgiving wickedness and rebellion and sin. Absolutely critical. It's the most quoted verse in the Bible by the Bible. And obviously our second revelation of what God is like is through the person of Jesus. Paul, in his letter to the Colossians, writes, the Son is the image of the invisible God. And likewise, the writer to the Hebrews writes, the Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being. If you want to know what God is like, then look at Jesus. And if you want to know what God's response to suffering is, then look at Jesus. Jesus moves towards the sufferer and suffering, not away from it. So if Jesus is the perfect image of God's view of it, interestingly, it's in suffering that we get the perfect expression of God's glory, which is on the cross. So I'd love someone to read Psalm 13, if they might. I can't see everyone, so is someone happy to read it? It's going to come up here. I wonder if anyone's happy to read it. If not, Sam will read it.
I don't mind reading it.
Thank you.
How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts, and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? Look on me and answer, Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death. And my enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my foes rejoice when I fall. But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing the Lord's praise, for he has been good to me.
Thanks, Julie, for he has been good to me. We're going to look at verse 5 in a little bit, but this is a psalm that encapsulates that heart cry to God, the sufferer who is deeply frustrated and feels separate and far from God. And one of the things I'd love us to think a little bit about is, do we have language? Can we put language to that felt absence of God in our lives? That feeling where we just feel that God is not there. That's what I really want to look at this evening. How do we understand the idea of God feeling like he is absent from us, even though we know that he isn't? And here the psalmist cries out, don't they? How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? As if God is actively removing himself from this psalmist's life, actively withdrawing. Does that happen? Does God actively withdraw from us? In 2010, I went through a little period in my life where I just had no connection with God at all. I was going to a church in London. The worship was very vibrant. People would quite regularly stand on chairs and wave banners, and there was a lot of noise, a lot of exuberance, and it was actually really fun. But in this particular period of my life, I was thinking about training for ordination, and suddenly my experience of worship, my experience of intimacy with God through scripture, and my prayer life, everything seemed, to use language that I used at the time, to dry up. I just couldn't connect with God. I opened the Bible and it just words on a page. I closed my eyes and tried to pray, and it were just words came out and fell to the floor. And I was standing in church surrounded by these exuberant people, waving banners and shouting and jumping up and down and having an absolutely amazing time. Do you remember those times? I know it's been a while for us to remember them. And I felt nothing. And my friend turned to me one evening and went, Tom, what's wrong? And I just said, I just have no experience of God right now. He's just not there. And I wonder whether you've ever experienced that recently or in your past, where it wasn't so much as a felt presence, you didn't feel the presence of God, but you actually felt his absence. He seemed like he wasn't there. Now, do we have any language for this? At that time, I didn't have any language for this. I thought maybe I'm depressed. Maybe I'm just going through what's going on. Maybe I'm eating the wrong things. I don't know. And then I discovered that actually in Christian spirituality, there is a phrase for this. And it is called the dark night of the soul. And that's what I wanted to spend the next 7 minutes just exploring. So what is the dark night? Now, it comes from a Spanish mystic from the 16th century, a poet called St. John of the Cross. And he wrote an extended poem when he was imprisoned by his fellow monks. Why they imprisoned him, we don't know. And he wrote this extended poem, and then he wrote two very long books around his poem, which he referenced as the dark night of the soul. But what is it not? Now, it's easy. I think there's a lot of misconceptions around this. What it's not, it is definitely not the only explanation for a lack of God's felt presence in our lives. Obviously, there's all sorts of reasons why we can't feel God's presence. It might be hurry, it might be hurry and distraction of the digital age that we're in. It may be sin, it may be a demonic thing. There's a whole load of reasons why we might not feel God's presence. So it's not, nor is it necessarily a time of pain or suffering, although the two may overlap. It's not necessarily a time of sickness or depression, or exhaustion or doubt, although the two may overlap. So it's therefore quite hard to diagnose. But here is a good definition. I see what you think of this. The dark night of the soul is a season in our apprenticeship, so our discipleship, to Jesus, where he intentionally takes away the felt presence of the felt sense of his presence in order to do a deep work of refinement and preparation in our soul for greater freedom, peace, love, and intimacy with God. Isn't that interesting? Is it possible for God to withhold his felt presence? Now, notice the language there. He takes his felt presence away. Not, he doesn't leave us, but he, according to this writer, he removes that feeling that we might have that he is present in order to do a deeper work within us. So in that time in 2010, and I really recognize it now, but I couldn't at the time, it was God removing his felt presence from me in order to do a deeper refining work in my heart and give me an opportunity for testing and refining. And what actually John of the Cross referenced it as purgation, but we use the word refinement. There's lots of metaphors in scripture around this. There's darkness in the Psalms, there's the desert, there's pruning from John chapter 15, and there's also hiding. And that is in the verse that we just read earlier, which it says in verse 2, verse 1, how long will you hide your face from me? You know, it says in 37 times in scripture that God hides from, referencing to his hiding. So it is about refining us in the deep parts of us. So what is this refining process and what does it look like? I'll carry on with this guy's description. It's a really good definition. He references it as an ongoing spiritual process in which we are liberated from attachments and compulsions and empowered to live and love more freely. An ongoing spiritual process in which we are liberated from attachments and compulsions and empowered to live and love more freely. Attachments. what were my attachments in 2010? In fact, they're probably quite similar to what they are today, but it's the things that I think I need to live a happy life. Those are my attachments, the things that I rely on in my life in order to fulfill what I think will fulfill me. It's what Thomas Kelly referenced as the emotional programs for happiness. So for me at that time, it was worship and music and song. I'm not saying those things in any way are bad in themselves, of course not. But for me, they become a bit of an idol, a bit of a crutch. But actually what God did in those times is he stopped me from relying on those things rather than him. And for me also, it was about distraction and noise. And he drew me to a place, a really uncomfortable place, where I had to rely on him rather than those programs for happiness that I employed. So in that sense, God was graciously allowing me to experience my own emptiness apart from him. I think is really interesting is that by withdrawing his felt presence, I felt vulnerable, I felt fearful, and I felt empty without him. And in doing that, by withdrawing from me his felt presence, then I actually began to grow in my understanding a little more of him and my reliance on him. It was gently forcing me to slow down. And I began to find joy in simple, quiet lack of striving. And in that sense, he was preparing me. It was before I became a vicar. He was preparing me for the next stage in my life with him in this world, leading me to a deeper place of love and joy. But I had to go through the dark night. I had to go through the cocoon before I could come out the other side. Now, obviously, we're always going through processes, and the discipleship journey it doesn't feel that linear. Sometimes it's a bit like a spiral, isn't it? So we might find that we're at a similar place to where we've been to before, but it's a different place in that journey. So God calls us. He calls us, and in that we move into a deeper dimension of our relationship with him. Now, why am I telling you this? Why is it important for us to know this? I'm going to skip that one there. Okay, we're coming to a close. I just think it's really important because it might put words in your own spiritual journey. We all have seasons in our life, or spiritual seasons in our life, and the dark night might be new to you. You might actually have got, well, I've had that experience before, and you might be able to put language to it. You may be going through something similar at this time, and it'd be worth talking to someone about it. Maybe you're thinking, well, I haven't, my experience of God might resonate with what I've just been talking about. Or indeed, it might be a preparation for what might be to come for you in the future. So what do we need to do? If you think you're in a dark night, or you may be in the future, just a couple of things to remember as I land the plane, as it were. It's not something we do, the dark night. It's something that God does in us. And all our job is to welcome God's work with trust and love. And that's the hard thing. That is particularly tricky, isn't it? To welcome what God is doing, even though we don't quite fully understand what he might be doing. So trust him as much as we can. Faith is a matter of trust, isn't it? And we trust in a person, in Jesus. We remember it's a season, it will pass. It's a stage in our spirituality. One of the things that I also have really relied on as going through one of these times is the little scaffold, the disciplines that we put in our place that can hold us as a scaffold in our lives. So whatever disciplines that you might have, stay true to them. Continue opening the Bible and scriptures. Continue to pray the prayers. For me, liturgy suddenly became really important, and we're going to read some liturgy as we do communion in a moment, because what liturgy did was that it was little handholds, little grips that I could hold on to in a time that seemed very bleak and very, I didn't really understand what was going on. And liturgy, as in spoken words, and even the Lord's Prayer, was something I could pray, even though I couldn't feel like I was really connecting with it. I prayed it, and it was like a handhold for me. And someone said, you don't fight your way out, you rest your way out of a dark night. You rest your way out. So we move towards community, we move towards rest, and a bit like Sabbath, and we trust God in those times. And we remember that God is not absent. And I'm just going to end with this final verse, which was at the end of Psalm 13, where the psalmist finally, after all that angst and all that frustration, is able to say this: I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord, for he has been good to me. I've got some